The Silkworm, from The Long Exile and Other Stories for Children by Count Leo Tolstoi. In my garden there were some old mulberry trees. They had been set out as long ago as my grandfather's time. Once I was given a quantity of silkworm eggs, and advised to raise the worms to make silk. These eggs were dark gray and so small that in my 2 drams and a half I counted 5,833 eggs. They were smaller than the heads of the smallest pins. They were perfectly inert. Only when they were crushed, they made a crackling sound. I heaped them up on my table and had forgotten all about them. But when spring came, I went one day out into my garden and noticed that the mulberry buds were swelling, and they were even in leaf when the sun got to them. Then I remembered about my silkworm eggs, and as soon as I went into the house, I began to examine them and scatter them all over a wider surface. The larger part of them were no longer of a dark gray as before, but some had turned into a light gray color, while others were still brighter with milky shades. The next morning I went early to look at the eggs and saw that the worms had already crept out of some of them, and the others had swollen and filled up. They had evidently become conscious in their shells, that the nutriment was ready for them. The little worms were black and hairy and so small that it was difficult to see them. I examined them with a magnifying glass and could see that in the egg they lay curled up in little rings, and when they emerged they straightened themselves out. I went out into the garden to my mulberry tree, gathered 3 handfuls of leaves, and laid them by themselves on the table, and I went to make a place for them as I had been told to do. While I was getting the paper ready, the worms perceived the presence of the leaves on the table and crawled over to them. I moved the leaves away and tried to attract the worms along, and they, just like dogs attracted by a piece of meat, crept in pursuit of the leaves, over the tablecloth, across the pencils, penknives, and papers. Then I cut out a sheet of paper and riddled it with holes made with a knife. I spread the leaves on the paper and laid the paper with the leaves over the worms. The worms crept through the holes. They all mounted on the leaves and immediately set to work feeding. In the same way I laid the paper covered with leaves over the other worms, and they likewise, as soon as they were hatched, immediately crept through the holes and began to feed. All the worms on each sheet of paper gathered together and ate the leaves, being at the edge. Then, when they stripped them clean, they began to crawl over the paper in search of new food. Then I would spread over them fresh sheets of perforated paper covered with mulberry leaves, and they would crawl through to the new food. They lay in my room on a shelf, and when there were no leaves, they would crawl over the shelf, reaching the very edge, but they never fell to the floor, although they were blind. As soon as the worm would come to the abyss, before letting himself down, he would put out of his mouth a little thread, and fasten it to the edge, and then let himself down, hang suspended, make investigations, and if it pleased him to let himself down, he would let himself down. But if he wanted to return, he would pull himself back up by means of his web. During all the 24 hours of the day, the worms did nothing else but feed, and it was necessary to give the mulberry leaves in greater and greater quantities. When fresh leaves were brought, and they were crawling over them, there would be a rustling sound like the noise of rain on foliage. This was made by them as they began to eat. In this way the old worms lived 5 days. By this time they had grown enormously, and would eat 10 times as much as they had done at first. I knew that on the 5th day it was time for them to roll themselves up, and I was on the watch for this to begin. In the evening of the 5th day, one of the old worms stretched himself out on the paper, and ceased to eat or move. The next day I watched him for a long time. I knew that the worms shed their skins a number of times, when they had grown so large, and that the shells were too small for them, and then they put on new ones. One of my companions took turns with me in watching the process. In the evening he ordered, "Hurry up, he is beginning to undress." I went over to the shelf and was just in time to see that this worm had fastened his old shell to the paper, and had made a rent near his mouth, was thrusting out his head, and was struggling and twisting so to get out. But his old shirt would not let him go. I looked at him for a long time, struggling, and was unable to extricate himself, and I felt a desire to help him. I tried to pick him out by means of my fingernails, but instantly saw that I had done a foolish thing. A sort of liquid gushed over my fingernail, and the worm died. I thought that it was his blood, but then I saw that the worm had under his skin a watery juice for the purpose of facilitating the process of slipping out of his shirt. My fingernail had evidently disturbed the formation of the new shirt, for the worm, though he was loosened, speedily perished. The others I did not touch any more, and in the same way they all came out of their shirts. A few of them, however, died, but all of them, after a long and painful struggle, at last emerged from their old shirts. After they had bolted, The worms began to eat more voraciously than ever, and I had to bring them still more mulberry leaves. In the course of 4 days they went to sleep again, and again went through the change of skin. Then they ate still more leaves, and they measured as much as the eighth of a verstock in length, which is 1.75 inches. Then at the end of 6 days they again went to sleep, and once more the transformation from old shells into new ones took place, and they began to be very large and fat, and we had really considerable trouble to keep them supplied with leaves. On the 9th day the old worms entirely ceased to feed, and they went crawling up on the shelf and the supports. I caught some of them and gave them fresh leaves, but they turned their heads away from the leaves and crawled off again. I then recollected that when silkworms, when they are about to spin their cocoons, absolutely cease to feed and go to climbing, I put them back and began to watch what they would do. Some of the old ones crawled on the ceiling, took up positions apart, each by himself, crawled around a little, and then began to fasten a web in various directions. I watched one in particular. He went into a corner, extended a half-dozen threads a distance of a verstock from him in every direction. Then he hung himself to it, doubled himself almost in two like a horseshoe, and began to move his head round and to send out a silken web in such a way that the web began to whip itself around him. By evening he was, as it were, in the midst of his own weaving. He could scarcely be seen, and on the next day he was entirely visible in his cocoon. He was entirely enwrapped in silk, and yet he still kept spinning. At the end of the 3 days he ceased to spin and died. Afterwards I learned how long a thread he had spun in those 3 days. If the whole cocoon be unwound, it will sometimes give a thread more than 3,500 feet in length and rarely less, and it is easy to reckon how many times the worm has to turn his head during these 3 days to spin such a thread. It will not be less than 300,000 times. In other words, he turns his head round without ceasing once every second for 72 hours. We noticed also after this labor was finished, when we took out a few of the cocoons and cut them open, that the worms were perfectly dry and white as wax. I was aware that from these cocoons, with their dry, white, wax-like insides, butterflies would come forth. But as I looked at them, I could not believe it. Still, on the 20th day I began to watch what would happen to those that I had left. I knew that on the 20th day the change would take place, and yet nothing was to be seen, and I even began to think that there was some mistake about it, when suddenly I noticed that the end of one of the cocoons had grown dark and moist. I was even inclined to believe that it was spoiled. I was inclined to throw it away. But then I thought, may it not be the beginning of the change? And so I kept watching to see what would happen, and in fact, from the moist spot something moved. For a long time I could not make out what it was, but then something appeared like a head with feelers. The feelers moved. Then I perceived that a leg was thrust through the hole, then another, and the leg was clinging hold and trying to get loose from the cocoon. Something came out farther and farther, and at last I perceived a moist butterfly. When all of its 6 legs were freed, the tail followed. When it was entirely out, it sat there. When the butterfly became dry, it was white. It spread its wings, flew up, circled around, and lighted on the window pane. At the end of 2 days the butterfly laid its eggs on the window sill and fastened them together. The eggs were yellowish in color. 25 butterflies laid their eggs. I collected 5,000 of them. The next year I raised more silkworms and spun off still more silk.